What dark secret are you hiding from everybody? Story 1. I have a secret fantasy life, populated with imaginary friends. It started in grade school and I've continued all my life. I'm in my 50s now and still prefer to be alone in my imaginary world instead of being with family or friends. I can't even tell my psychiatrist because I'm afraid he's going to lock me up or give me drugs to make it all stop. Story 2. Last Christmas, I learned my sister and I don't have the same father, and are technically half-sisters. My sister's biological father tried to start a relationship with my mother. That resulted in a pregnancy, and ultimately did not work out. That biological father is dead now, but I don't probe any further about his identity, or how he died, in case it was something traumatic for my mother to remember. So, she raised my sister as a single mother at my grandma's house in the 1980s. Then she met my father and they started dating, and it worked out because they got married in the 90s. Moved into a new house, and a short time after I was born. She told me never call my sister my half-sister and just pretend all of this doesn't matter because she's my sister. And I'm keeping it that way. And if anyone asks about the 10-year age gap, I'll just tell them, it's a long story. Story 3. I'm the spitting image of my grandpa on my father's side. Both my parents are almost a foot shorter than me, but I'm almost the same height as him. When my mother got sick when I was a kid, my grandpa went to visit her daily for extended periods of time in the hospital. In his final month, she did the same. After he passed away, we found out he kept a whole other family on the side in secret. Looking back at my dad's military deployment history, it would also be dicey if she could have gotten pregnant by him around the appropriate time. Based on a collection of various hunches, I'm fairly convinced I'm the product of an affair between my mother and supposed grandfather. More disturbingly, this would probably be one of the most lighthearted revelations about my family. Story 4. When I was young, probably around age 9 or 10, I was walking home with my dog from a house around the block where he cut the corner and walked diagonally through the yard of this super mean old lady who lived at the end of the street. She was in her yard at the time tending to those really fancy-looking rose bushes that she had growing in beds along the border with her neighbor. My dog was a fairly friendly golden retriever who didn't even really come near her, and certainly did not do anything threatening. But she sprayed the duck out of him with some kind of pesticides or other chemicals she was using on her roses. I ran back home with my dog and hosed his face off. He coughed a bunch but seemed fine otherwise. I never told my parents because somehow I thought I was going to get in trouble for letting the dog walk in her yard. Well, I'm glad I never told them though, because I decided that night to sneak downstairs, out the half-bath window, down the street to her yard where I cut down every gosh dang rose bush I could get my hands on. Story 5. A man broke into my home about 10 years ago. Well, kind of. He knocked, I answered the door, and he pushed his way in. He spoke about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and tried to extort me for protection, or his brothers of doom would come and kill me. He was huge, ex-Navy if he was to be believed, drunk as heck, hand covered in blood, holding a broken bottle. I was absolutely terrified. I told him to leave and he wouldn't. He was getting aggressive. I told him I would splatter his brains against the wall if he did not leave. I didn't have a gun at the time. Anyways, he did not leave. I went into my kitchen, grabbed a knife, and sliced him a few times. He staggered away, seemingly okay, and I assumed he was alright, just a little bit wounded. I never saw him again. A neighbor told me days later a man was found dead with some wounds on his arm. I can only guess he bled out, but I never got questioned somehow. There was a lot of blood in and around my house. I just lived in a pretty seedy area, so I guess the cops just didn't care. The guy was apparently a repeat criminal. Story 6. This one's not my secret, it's my mom's. And I'm not hiding it from everyone, just the person who's potentially mattering it to the most. When my mom was in high school in the 60s, She had a long-term serious boyfriend named Jimmy. Jimmy, well, yeah, they were each other's first. They were together for years and were planning on getting married. He went away to college and my mom stayed behind, but they were still together. You know what happened next? He cheated, got the girl pregnant. He comes home to break the news to mother. Well, getting rid of the baby was not legal at the time. He basically says that he wants to be with my mom, but he has no choice but to marry this other girl. So, my mom was devastated. Here's the secret. My mother was also pregnant by him. But she never told him, well, not yet. She decided she wasn't ever going to tell him. Jimmy went on to marry the other girl and never knew my mom was pregnant. She told me that she later threw herself down a flight of stairs and it caused a miscarriage. My mom actually reconnected with Jimmy during the early days of Facebook. She didn't have an account but asked me to look for him using mine, and he was still married to the same person. My mom was married to my dad and they wrote to each other for a while using my account, and they signed their messages saying, "I love you." Well, my mom passed away a number of years ago, and I think about this knowledge I have that Jimmy doesn't know. This major life event thing that he doesn't even know happened. That could have changed the trajectory of many, many lives. I'm certainly not going to tell him. It's my dirty secret to not tell. Story 7. When I was younger, I lived with my grandmother. Not long after I turned 18, her health starts to decline. And sort of decline that you know means she won't be around for much longer. Over the months, I did my best to take care of her, getting her to the hospital when she needed and other things. We had someone coming every day to help her with things I could not. Well, what my family doesn't know is that the night she passed, I was in the living room watching TV. My dog was in bed with Grandma, and I started to hear him whimper and bark. I knew what was happening. I knew that if I acted, I could probably, potentially save her. I didn't want to watch her suffer anymore, though, or watch her live with so much pain. I'm unable to do anything for herself anymore, so I made the choice to let her pass before making any calls. She lived 92 years, and the only regret I have is that she passed a month after I would have graduated if I hadn't been kicked out of school. She'd been in good enough health at the time to go to my graduation, and I still kick myself for how stupid I was back then. Story 8. My wife, her mom, and I bought a house about 2 years ago. Just from talking to the neighbors, I'd gathered that a family lived here before had a daughter that was mixed up with the wrong people. We had some random person knock on our door at night saying he needed gas. We're down a long driveway, no way you just randomly walk up to our house to ask for help. I think he was looking for the people who used to live here. And then another time, Sunday morning, making pancakes for the family, I get a knock at the door and it's 4 sheriffs saying they received a call from emergency services that hung up, and it was from this house. We don't even have a landline. I assured them that my wife and 2-year-old did not make the call. Then they mentioned the name of the previous occupants and I let them know we moved in earlier this year, and they seemed okay with that and left. Anyways, I was doing some yard work and struck up a conversation with a neighbor. He saw the police cars and asked me what was up. I told him the situation and he just says, "Oh yeah, that family was messed up. The cops were probably being cautious considering the shooting." "What shooting?" I asked him. He kind of looks at me with a sad, worried face and says, "Ah, buddy, the shooting in your house." "Wait, what?" I say, truly baffled. He then proceeds to tell me that about 2 years before, the father in the house confronted his daughter and boyfriend he didn't like and shot and killed the boyfriend in the home. Our state doesn't have a disclosure law, so we never knew. I was blown away. All the strange happenings kinda made sense now. He said the friends of the victim had kinda terrorized them for a while because the police were taking so long to press charges. Slashed tires, midnight fireworks, stupid stuff that the neighbors hated. I was shocked but just said, "Well, that's crazy." But they do me a favor and never tell my wife or mother-in-law about that. They're a little spooked by things like that. Story 9. In high school, I was a super good kid. Straight A student who loved homework, keeping out of trouble, and who was quiet as heck during class. So, anyways, There was this guy who also is in AP classes with me, but he was super loud and obnoxious, but would pull stunts in such ways that he would have some margin of plausible deniability. Though we never spoke, I'm not sure he even knew I existed. He just rubbed me the wrong way. Maybe it was from the one cold day when this other girl in our class, well, she had her nipples poking through her shirt because she forgot to sweater, and he kept saying, "Dang, girl, it's cold, huh?" Maybe it was from when he would pretend to be friends with the kid who was definitely spectrum, and desperate to be friends with him, to do the bully's homework for him, and then bully him the next day. I don't know. So, at random, sometimes once a week or a month or once every couple of months, I would whistle. It's this high-pitched whistle that sounds like a tea kettle going off that I can do while barely moving my mouth. Back then, no one knew I could do it except for my family, and the super obnoxious kid always got in trouble for it. I was never the one suspected. Story 10. In middle school, I made a smoking pipe out of a copper pipe just for fun. I know you shouldn't smoke out of copper as the fumes are potentially toxic. My stepdad took it from me and starts using it. He smoked it for years. I hate him, always have, for physically abusing me, so I never said a word about it. It's now 30 years later, and he's diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's, and likely only has a few years left to live. I hope he rots. I don't know if it had any effect, but I like to think the copper pipe played a role in his sickness as karma for being an a-hole. Story 11. My best friend's Mark was watching American's Most Wanted one night, and they did a segment on a guy who looked just like a tenant of his. Luckily, Mark lived in his own house while the tenant lived in a 3-family house Mark owned. Mark called the number while the show was still airing. Tenant was picked up and he was the right guy. He had no idea he'd been featured on America's Most Wanted just a few hours earlier. Quick edit. The tenant, well, he committed murder, but it wasn't an exciting national murder story. It was some kind of biker beef in the PNW. The house Mark owned was in Queens, New York. Mark called the number on America's Most Wanted, and the guy was arrested a few hours later by what neighbors said were throngs of LEO. As for nationally known murderers, I went to Catholic school with a girl who was murdered by her older brother. He killed the rest of her family too. Her name was Dawn, and she was a very nice, quiet girl. Her brother was a jerk, so were the couple who moved into their house after the murders, the Lutzes. This husband and wife, George and Kathy Lutz, got together with a 2-bit writer, and they cooked up the Amityville horror. Nowadays, domestic murders are in the news every day, but back then there were so few and far between that scammers were able to turn a family tragedy into a freaking franchise. Happily, the Lutzes didn't live to be the senior citizens. Story 12. When I was around 5 or 6, my mom and dad were fighting just about every day. Well, I was napping on the couch when my mom came in very upset and she shook me awake. She asked me if I saw the girl my dad brought home. I've always felt terrible for this because I hadn't even seen anyone but my dad the whole day. I'm pretty sure he was just playing video games like usual, but for some reason in my sleepy kid brain, I said yeah. I said she was with him in their room. I'm honestly not sure why I lied like that, but they got a divorce shortly after and I always felt like it was my fault. Until I recently found out my little sister is actually my half-sister, but that's a whole nother story. Story 13. The first part isn't exactly dark, but when I was a kid around 9 or so, my cousin, who was 12 at the time, would make out with me. I didn't really know better at the age, but thought I'd be in trouble if I talked about it. For whatever reason, about 6 years went by before I saw him again, and it was never brought up, never mentioned. He was like a totally different person. I sometimes wonder if it ever even happened. My memory isn't very reliable, and it was a long time ago since I'm in my 20s now. Fast forward a little bit more, and I found out that he died a couple years ago while cleaning a gun. Accidentally shot himself. My great aunt, who's his grandma and who basically raised him, believes wholeheartedly that it was an accident. But I suspect it wasn't. He grew up around guns, and knowing how they work and how to empty them and everything, I find the odds that he accidentally forgot to empty the chamber pretty low. I also know he was struggling with depression and brain damage from a car accident a year prior, but I won't tell my aunt any of this. I think it might break her little heart. Story 14. Funny, lighthearted story from my childhood. My little brother was in the shower and I could hear him singing. I put a coat on backwards and a stocking cap pulled over my face and waited outside the bathroom door. He opened the door, still singing and dancing kind of, and I did the Frankenstein thing. Arms out, moaning, "Urgh." He screamed and fell backwards, knocking the toilet completely over. Water going everywhere. The top of the toilet tank broke, shower curtain ripped down, and him laying on the floor in the middle of all this, so I ran back down the hall, coat and hat off, and sauntered back casually. By then, my mother and father and our sisters were there, and everyone's like, what the heck? I've heard him tell this story as proof of the existence of ghosts. To this day, little feller is now 52 years of age, a bank manager with 2 kids. He still believes it was a ghost. I don't feel a bit bad. Story 15. Cutting off my dad was the best decision I've ever made. I hope it kills him inside every day to not know how his only child and only grandchildren are doing. I tried for years to have a relationship with him since age 10 until 18. From 10 to 13, he would tell me he wished I would have died when I was sick as a kindergartner because I wouldn't have tattled and ruined his marriage to my mother. I tried multiple times but was unsuccessful. I still try to have a relationship with him for my mother, just to help her financially, and would visit him for months. He'd keep me locked in a closet for hours at age 14. From 16 to 18, he thought throwing money around would help me, but I was already working by then and it did not matter. I still have my daily battle where I ask myself if he's right or not. But I see my kid and I can't imagine thinking such vile things about them at that age, like my dad did about me.